Introduction to Psychology. We've gone through developmental psychology, and I hope you understand that we change in every aspect of our life, that something is going to be different regardless of what age we are, what stage we are. You can expect to be different 5 years from now than when you are today. It's just a part of being the human and having the human experience. Where we're going to head right now, though, is into an area of psychology that is actually dear to my heart, because it's what the basis of my doctorate degree is social psychology. And just to kind of give an explanation of what social psychology is, so you can see right here on the screen, the definition of social psychology. It is a little bit different than our general definition. So the general definition of psychology is a scientific study of human behavior and mental processes. So it focuses on the individual. So in general, psychology is the focus of individuals' behaviors and mental processes. Social psychology is a scientific attempt to explain how the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors of individuals are influenced by the actual imagined or implied presence of other human beings. And so this not only looks at the individual, but how the individual responds to the social world of other people. So social psychology is different in the essence that it adds what we call additional external variables, the influence of other people on the psychology of human beings. And I think this is important for one main reason, and well, actually for several reasons, but the major reason is what we have found in social neuroscience and the operation of our brain. And there's two things that I want to highlight to show why our social world is so important, at least from a brain perspective. It was assumed for the longest time that our brain was this basically human calculator, that it was this logical um, thing that is meant to process information, and is why we have things like architectural buildings and airplanes and computers and cell phones, because of all of this logical calculating brain that we have. Well, over the last 30 years, we've actually found that the area of the brain that actually does those types of calculations is actually relatively small. In fact, if you take a sheet of paper and let's say that represents the frontal cortical area of the brain, which processes those higher human things like mathematics, like our complex language, like analytical information, not necessarily language, I'll take that back a little bit, but logical inferential information is what I should say. If we take that, let's take an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, just a basic sheet of paper. If you put a quarter on that piece of paper, and let's say that piece of paper represents the area of the brain that deals with those complex human thoughts, that quarter is what would represent things like mathematics, logical thinking, all of that other stuff. The rest of that piece of paper manages, understands our complex social systems. The other interesting aspect of the brain is something called our default network. And this is a kind of an interesting thing, is that whenever we're not thinking about things like mathematics or problem solving or something like that, our brains automatically, unconsciously, without any effort, and we cannot control it, goes to what's called a default network mode. This default network mode is also the area of the brain that lights up when we are doing social thinking about our relationship between ourselves and others. So this can be in microseconds or even seconds. So in some experiments, I'll have students doing, or individuals doing math problems, and they'll just say, at random points, we will say stop and then go, stop and then go. And what they found by doing brain studies and looking at the brain functioning is, even with just a 1 second stop, go, Just like that, in 1 second, the brain still flashed back to that default network in that flash of a second and started thinking about your social world. And then when you had to come back to the math, then it switched back to that logical area. So from the brain research, we know that humans are unequivocally social beings. From an evolutionary perspective, this is what is the basis of our survival. Human beings cannot live without each other. We cannot exist without one another. This whole idea that a man can be his own island or a woman can be their own ship or whatever is a false assumption, it's a false narrative of human existence. We literally, without someone, without human contact, literally start to die as if we're starving from hunger or thirst. And it's just a human fact that humans need other humans to exist. And so social psychology tries to focus on this and tries to understand this relationship we have with our fellow human beings and why it's so important. Now, on my level, on my personal level, the reason why I got into social psychology is because I was so frustrated with individual psychology, which mainly deals with behavioral health and mental health and that field. I was so frustrated with success rates. If you know anything about mental health, behavioral mental health, they take after the medical model, which puts everything on the individual, meaning that the mental health condition is due to the individual, even if it's a small child. If that child has ADHD or some other mental or psychological disorder, it's because of the child. It's not because of any other external variable to that individual. And you treat that symptom, and you treat the symptoms of that individual, and you don't look anywhere else except for the individual to try and figure out what's wrong with them. And mental health field has an incredibly low success rate, and throughout that field, there's no accountability because the client is unwilling to change. It has nothing to do with my expertise as a counselor or a therapist or a psychologist. It's because the client doesn't want to change. It's the client's fault. They'll change when they're willing and able to change. And it was incredibly frustrating. So I left that, and in my master's degree, I thought, well, maybe it's an organizational issue. So I went into organizational psychology and started to work on the organizational director level, executive director level of mental health and social welfare and abuse and all of those fields, and realized, yes, nonprofits are messed up. Um, they don't promote correctly, all this other stuff, but nothing that states that it's the administration that is causing our poor mental health results. And so then I was exposed to work being done by Philip Zimbardo, work being done by other social psychologists. And in my earlier years, I didn't pay much attention to it, but I started looking at it, and I started paying attention to this idea that the world is individuals are much more influenced by their social world than their own personality, by their own disposition, by their own motivation. And this intrigued me. And then I read a book on loneliness and by Casepio and Lieberman's social uh, book on social being, and it convinced me, both of those convinced me that our existence is dependent upon each other, and so is our own psychological and mental well-being. And in fact, we'll find in here, when we review loneliness, how much of our health is actually dependent upon being socially connected to each other more than it is our eating habits, exercise habits, smoking habits, or whatever it may be. It's more important to keep social connection than it is to eat right, for example. Um, but with that being said, once I started taking social psychological ideas into And then I started developing programs that were incredibly successful, and actually had higher success rates than failure rates. And so that's why I have become convinced that we need to start focusing on the social aspects of individual worlds more than blaming the individual for much of their areas. The other unique aspect of social psychology is that social psychology has three basic themes. One is group influence and the power of groups, and we'll get to that in the next couple sections. The other one, which is unique to social psychology, and if you look at most societies of social psychology, it's called personality and social psychology, individual differences and social psychology. And that's because within social psychology, we believe that subjective experience, the individual actually matters. If you look at the rest of the psychology, you look at, if you look, for example, when we get to the clinical areas, we're going to say, in order to have schizophrenia, you have to have these symptoms. But in a lot of ways, we stop at those symptoms and state that nothing else matters except for those symptoms. How the person experiences those symptoms really doesn't matter. All we need to do is focus on those symptoms and the person will get better. That's not really how we approach it in social psychology. We approach it in that, yes, we need to understand the dynamics of the situation and then how that situation is influencing the subjective reality of that individual. The other thing that we understand in social psychology is that we don't always need these big, huge, life-changing ideas to change behaviors. In fact, most behaviors change through very small manipulations, which we'll get to later in the course, and I'll try and prove this to you a little bit later in this module. But those are the three themes of social psychology, and we will get to these more and more in depth. I just want to give an explanation of where we're headed, and I hope you enjoy this section.